It began with the sound of tires crunching gravel and the steady hum of an old truck winding through narrow country roads, the kind where the trees leaned close as if guarding secrets. The road curved along Silverpine Lake, its still waters reflecting the early morning fog. Mark Turner drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting on the faded photograph sitting on the dashboard. A picture of his grandfather standing proudly in front of the lake mansion. The same house that now waited ahead, broken and forgotten. 20 years had passed since he last saw it. 20 years since his family left after his grandfather's death, leaving the property to time and weather. He had always told himself he would return one day, fix it up, bring life back into the walls that once held laughter and Sunday dinners. And now, after 2 decades, he finally was. But nothing prepared him for what he was about to see. As the road opened up, the lake came into view, wide and calm, the kind of water that looked peaceful until you realized how deep it ran. The mansion stood on the far edge, its silhouette rising against the mist like a ghost of its former self. The white pillars were stained gray with age, the red roof had patches of rust, and the porch railing was half broken. The front yard was overgrown with wild grass and ivy that crawled up the walls like veins. Mark slowed the truck, his eyes scanning the property with a mix of sorrow and determination. It wasn't the home he remembered, but it was still his. He could almost hear his grandfather's voice in his head, rough and warm, saying, "This land will always be yours, boy. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." He parked near the old gate, stepping out into the crisp morning air that smelled of pine and damp soil. The sound of birds filled the silence, but something about the air felt wrong, like a song played slightly off-key. The place should have been still, abandoned, untouched. But as Mark rested his hand on the rusty gate latch, a low rumble rolled across the distance. He frowned, turning toward the lake, and froze. Across the narrow dirt path that led down to the dock, engines were roaring, heavy, mechanical, and close. Bulldozers. Not one, not two, but an entire convoy lined up in formation near the shoreline, their yellow metal glinting beneath the pale sunlight. For a moment, Mark thought he was imagining it. But then he saw movement. People in reflective vests walking back and forth, gesturing, pointing. A woman in a sharp navy jacket stood at the front, holding a clipboard. She turned, her voice sharp and commanding. "That's the structure we're removing today," she shouted over the noise, pointing straight at the mansion. Mark's breath caught in his chest. Remove. His hands tightened around the gate, disbelief washing through him like ice. He stepped forward, slowly at first, then faster, his boots crunching against the gravel. "Hey!" he called out, his voice echoing across the empty yard. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" The woman looked up, annoyed that someone had interrupted her order. She signaled the workers to pause, then turned toward him with the kind of smile that wasn't really a smile. "Good morning, sir," she said coolly. "Can I help you?" Mark's jaw tightened. "You can start by telling me why you're pointing at my house." The woman blinked, pretending to be polite. "Your house?" she repeated. "I'm afraid you're mistaken. This property falls under the Silverpine Lakeside Community Association's jurisdiction now. It's been marked for removal as part of the new lake restoration project." Mark's stomach turned. "Jurisdiction?" he repeated, taking another step closer. "Lady, this land has been in my family for 70 years. You're standing on private property." The woman laughed softly, almost pityingly, flipping through her clipboard. "According to our records, this section was abandoned for over 2 decades. The HOA acquired it through the county's reclamation program last year. We're building a public trail here to beautify the shoreline." Mark's voice lowered, calm but hard. "And you didn't think to check with the actual owner before sending in bulldozers?" The woman shrugged, unbothered. "Sir, the paperwork is already processed. I'm sure if there's been a misunderstanding, you can file a complaint with the HOA board. But for now, I'd appreciate it if you didn't interfere." She turned to signal her crew again. Mark stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "No one's touching that house," he said. His tone wasn't loud, but it carried weight. The workers nearby stopped what they were doing, glancing nervously between him and their supervisor. The woman crossed her arms, her patience wearing thin. "You're not authorized to be here," she snapped. "If you don't leave immediately, I'll call security." Mark took another step closer, his eyes cold. "You go ahead," he said quietly. "Call whoever you want. But those machines don't move another inch." The standoff stretched for a long, tense moment. The woman, Karen Bishop as her name tag read, finally exhaled sharply and waved her hand. "Fine," she said. "We'll pause for now, but this doesn't change anything. I'll have the county verify ownership." Mark didn't answer. He just stood there, staring at the bulldozers, the machines that had been seconds away from ripping into his family's history. As the HOA crew began to disperse, he walked slowly toward the mansion. The front steps creaked under his boots, the old wood groaning in protest. Inside, the air was thick with dust and memories. Faded wallpaper peeled off the walls, old furniture stood covered with sheets, and the faint scent of cedar lingered like a ghost from the past. He ran his hand across the banister of the staircase, the same one he'd slid down as a boy. His throat tightened. "I'm home, Grandpa," he murmured. Outside, the engines died one by one, the sound fading into uneasy quiet. Mark stood at a broken window, watching the HOA trucks drive off down the dirt road. His reflection stared back at him in the glass, older, tougher, but just as stubborn as the man who'd raised him. They thought they could take his home because no one had been here to stop them. But they were wrong. They had no idea who he was or what he was capable of. He spent the next few hours walking the property, every step stirring more anger and resolve. The lake shimmered quietly in the distance, the waterline glinting gold in the sunlight, but near the shoreline, fresh tire tracks scarred the soil. He knelt down, running his fingers through the grooves. The ground was still soft, the tracks deep. They'd already begun setting up demolition points. Stakes with red ribbons marked the edges of what they called the project zone. He followed them to the far side of the property and found fresh survey flags planted in a perfect line, right through the middle of his grandfather's garden. His hands curled into fists. When the sun began to sink, Mark sat on the old porch, the air cool and heavy with the scent of rain. He reached into his bag and pulled out a leather folder filled with the original property documents, yellowed with age but still legible. The deed bore his grandfather's signature, and below it, his father's. His name had been added after the will was processed 20 years ago. The land was his, legally, rightfully, unquestionably his. So how had the HOA gotten approval? He flipped through every page, his brow furrowed. There had to be a trick somewhere, a forged signature, a manipulated record. Someone had done this quietly, counting on no one ever coming back. But he had come back. That night, the storm rolled in from across the lake, lightning flashing behind the clouds, thunder echoing off the hills. Mark lit a lantern in the old living room, the flickering light casting long shadows on the cracked walls. He sat at the same desk his grandfather had used, papers spread out before him. Every gust of wind that shook the windows only strengthened his resolve. They thought the mansion was forgotten. They thought no one would fight for it. But Mark Turner wasn't leaving again. Not this time. When dawn came, the air was damp and still. Mist hung low over the water, and the bulldozers were gone. But deep down, Mark knew they would be back. People like Karen Bishop didn't lose quietly. They would come with more papers, more rules, more threats disguised as regulations. But he also knew something else. He wasn't the boy who once played on this land. He was a man who had built cities, written contracts, and taken on bureaucracies bigger than any homeowners association. Standing on the porch, he looked out over the lake, his reflection rippling in the still water. "You wanted a fight," he whispered to the air. "You've got one." Then he smiled faintly, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes but promised trouble for anyone standing in his way. Behind him, the mansion loomed like an old soldier ready to stand one last battle. The fight for Silverpine Lake had just begun, and this time, it was personal. The next morning, the fog still clung to the surface of Silverpine Lake, the water like glass reflecting the pale sky. But the peace that had settled overnight shattered the moment the low hum of engines broke through the stillness again. Mark Turner's eyes snapped open where he had slept on an old couch inside the mansion, dust still in his lungs and determination heavy in his chest. He stood quickly, pulling on his jacket and stepped onto the porch. The sight that greeted him froze him in place. The convoy of bulldozers had returned. Their yellow frames lined up near the dock, engines idling, exhaust curling like smoke into the cool morning air, and standing proudly in front of them, holding a clipboard as if she were queen of the lake, was Karen Bishop, the HOA president. Her perfectly pressed suit looked out of place in the mud, but her expression carried the arrogance of someone who thought power came from paper. Mark walked down the steps slowly, his boots crunching through the gravel, and for a moment, no one spoke. The workers watched him uneasily, sensing the tension that hung between him and the woman by the gate. Karen saw him coming and raised her chin, her voice cutting through the hum of the machines. "Mr. Turner, I assume?" she said, as if she were addressing a stranger trespassing on her land. "We've verified the records, and as I told you yesterday, this structure has been deemed unsafe and non-compliant under Community Development Code. We're proceeding with demolition this morning." Mark stopped halfway down the driveway, his eyes locked on hers, his tone even, calm and cold. "Unsafe?" he asked. "The only danger here is you and whatever fake paperwork you're waving around." Karen smiled in that infuriating way that people do when they believe they're untouchable. "The county approved our project, Mr. Turner, and unless you'd like to take it up in court, which could take months, we suggest you stand aside and let us continue. This property is now part of the Silverpine Lakeside Improvement Zone." She said it like it was final, like she had already won, but she hadn't met a Turner before. Mark stepped closer, the morning light glinting off the metal deed case in his hand. He opened it slowly and held up a single page. The county seal faded but visible, his voice steady. "This," he said, "is the original land deed, signed and registered by my grandfather in 1952, renewed under my name in 2004. This land, this house, and every inch of the soil around it belong to the Turner family, and that means your machines, your paperwork, and your people are trespassing. You've got 5 minutes to pack up and leave." Karen's expression faltered for the first time, but pride kept her voice sharp. "You think a piece of old paper scares me?" she said, crossing her arms. "That document's irrelevant now. We have legal jurisdiction from the county." Mark tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Do you?" he said quietly. "Or did you just convince some clerk to sign a fraudulent claim and hope no one would notice?" Her lips parted, caught off guard. But he didn't give her the chance to recover. "Because I've already spoken to the county records office, and they're reviewing your zoning permit as we speak. You might want to check your inbox before you start destroying private property." The workers had stopped pretending to look busy, watching the exchange nervously. The engine noises dwindled one by one as they turned off their machines. Karen glanced around, realizing the audience was no longer on her side. "This isn't over," she said sharply. "You can't stop a community development project. We have authority from the HOA board." Mark gave a faint smile, not one of amusement but of quiet certainty. "You can't stop what's coming either," he replied. "And when the county's done digging through your files, you'll wish you had." He turned away then, walking back up the path, leaving her fuming in silence, her carefully built confidence cracking like thin ice. Behind her, one of the crew members muttered, "Ma'am, maybe we should wait until this is sorted out." She snapped at him to be quiet, but her voice wavered, the first sign that doubt had crept into her perfect little plan. By the time Mark reached the porch again, the engines had gone quiet, the sound replaced by the low whispers of the wind across the lake. He stood there, watching as Karen made a few frantic phone calls before storming off with her clipboard clutched tight. The bulldozers followed one by one, their heavy tires leaving deep ruts in the mud, and within minutes, the property was empty again, the silence returning like a living thing. Mark exhaled slowly, his hands tightening around the rail, the old wood creaking under his grip. He knew this was just the beginning. People like Karen didn't retreat easily. She would come back, maybe with lawyers, maybe with more men and bigger machines. But that was fine. He wasn't leaving anymore, not for anyone. This was his land, and he would defend it the same way his grandfather would have. Quietly, patiently, and with unshakable resolve. That evening, Mark drove into town, his truck's headlights cutting through the fading twilight. He stopped at the county office just before closing. A middle-aged clerk looked up as he entered. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked. Mark set the deed folder on her desk and said, "I need you to check every land transfer connected to parcel number 314B, Silverpine Lake." The clerk frowned, flipping through her computer files. That one's been active lately. Looks like it was transferred under community zoning approval last year. Strange though, it's missing an original owner signature." She looked up, curious. "You wouldn't happen to be the original owner?" Mark finished, his voice firm. "And I didn't sign anything." The clerk's eyes widened slightly, realizing what that meant. "Sir, this could be a serious violation," she whispered. "If that signature was forged, the entire acquisition is invalid." Mark nodded slowly. "Then start the process to invalidate it. I'll bring every record you need." She nodded, lowering her voice. "I'll flag it for review immediately." When he walked back out, the night had grown darker, the town quiet, and the reflection of the lake shimmered under the moonlight as he drove past. He rolled down the window, letting the cold air fill the cab, his mind racing but focused. They had tried to erase his name with ink and arrogance, but they'd made one fatal mistake. They underestimated him by morning. He would have lawyers involved, and soon after, the HOA would find themselves cornered by their own lies. Back at the mansion, he parked his truck, the tires sinking slightly into the damp soil. The house loomed ahead, cracked but strong, and he looked up at it with a faint smile. "They don't know who they're dealing with," he murmured to himself, then walked inside, the creaking floorboards greeting him like old friends. Outside, the wind picked up again, rustling through the trees, carrying with it the faint sound of thunder from far across the lake. A storm was coming, and this time, it wasn't weather, it was Mark Turner. The next day dawned gray and heavy, the sky hanging low over Silverpine Lake like a lid trapping in the cold mist. Mark Turner woke before sunrise, the creak of the mansion's old floorboards echoing softly under his steps as he moved through the house. Every corner seemed to whisper memories of his childhood. The smell of pine, the faint creak of the porch swing, the sound of his grandfather's boots on these same steps decades ago. But today nostalgia had no place here. Today was about answers, the kind buried in ink and lies. He poured himself a cup of black coffee from the old kettle, took a deep breath, and sat down at his grandfather's desk with the folder of papers spread open like a battlefield. The original deed, the survey maps, the property tax receipts, all marked under the Turner name. But what caught his attention was a recent map, an official document that claimed to represent the Silverpine Lakeside Community Development Zone. And there it was in bold red lines, his property, cut in half, one section labeled HOA Common Land. His name erased completely. He stared at it for a long time, his jaw clenched, the edges of the paper trembling slightly in his hands. It wasn't an error, it was deliberate. Someone had redrawn the boundaries and pushed his land into the HOA's control. He leaned back in the chair, exhaling slowly through his nose. This wasn't just arrogance. This was theft under the mask of paperwork, the kind done by people who thought they'd never be caught. He picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts, stopping at a name he hadn't called in years, Ellen Porter, an old friend from his engineering days. Now a property rights attorney, he hesitated for only a moment before dialing. The phone rang twice before she answered, her voice warm but surprised. "Mark Turner? I thought you vanished off the map." He smiled faintly. "Guess I did. But I've got a situation and you're the only one who can help." She listened quietly as he explained. The forged zoning maps, the HOA's sudden claim, the demolition threat. When he finished, there was a long pause on the other end before she said, "Send me everything, every document, every picture. If what you're saying is true, they've broken more than one law." Within an hour, Mark had scanned every document he had and sent them off. Then he grabbed his jacket and keys, deciding to head back to the county office, the one place where the truth had to exist. Buried under signatures and bureaucratic dust, the drive through town was quiet, only a few cars passing. Most people still unaware that their lakeside community was built on a stolen foundation. When he walked into the records building, the same clerk from yesterday greeted him nervously. "Mr. Turner, we've started looking into your request, and, well, there are some irregularities," she said, lowering her voice. The file for your property was transferred into the HOA's name through a zoning reassignment form. But that form doesn't have your signature. It has someone else's. Mark's eyes darkened. Whose? He asked. A name that appears on several HOA filings. Karen Bishop. The words hit him like a hammer, not from shock, but from confirmation. He had suspected her from the start, but hearing her name written into his property's theft made it real. Can you get me a copy? He asked. The clerk hesitated, glancing over her shoulder. Technically, I'm not supposed to release copies of active investigations, but... She slid a paper across the counter quietly. You didn't get this from me? She whispered. He looked down and there it was. Karen Bishop's name signed neatly under acquisition approval. A forged signature in the box marked previous owner. Where his name should have been, the handwriting wasn't even close, but that didn't matter. It had fooled the system long enough to let her push her project through. He took a photo of the form and nodded to the clerk. You just helped expose something big, he said. Thank you. Outside, the air was thick with tension, the kind that comes before a fight. He stood by his truck staring at the photo on his phone, the fake signature mocking him from the screen. Ellen called back a few minutes later, her tone brisk and sharp. Mark, I've reviewed your documents and you're right. The HOA altered zoning boundaries illegally. That's felony-level forgery. If you file an injunction now, the county will freeze every permit tied to that development. Mark's grip tightened on the phone. Do it, he said. I want them stopped before they move another inch. I'll handle the legal work, Ellen replied. But you need to prepare for pushback. HOAs like this don't go down quietly. They'll fight, they'll twist, and they'll threaten, but keep everything on record. Mark's voice stayed even. Let them fight. I've built bridges that lasted longer than their lies. By the time he returned to the mansion, the sun was low and the air was filled with the hum of cicadas. The old porch creaked under his boots as he carried in a box of supplies. Files, a camera, a tape recorder, and his laptop. He was setting up camp, not just to fix the house, but to defend it. He sat at the kitchen table, flipping through each old photo his grandfather had taken, labeling them by year and scanning them into the computer. Every image of the mansion before its decline would serve as proof of ownership and history. He wanted the record so airtight that even the most corrupt lawyer couldn't poke a hole in it. Outside, the sky began to darken, and as he worked, lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating the lake in brief, silvery bursts. His phone buzzed again. A text from Ellen. Filed the injunction. Effective immediately. HOA is legally prohibited from any demolition or development until further notice. Mark exhaled. A slow, deep breath that carried a weight of relief and fury. It was a small victory, but it was enough to steady him. He stepped outside, standing on the porch as the wind swept in from across the lake. The air smelled of rain and cold metal. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called, and in that moment, he felt his grandfather's presence again, quiet, watching, proud. They tried to bury us, Grandpa, he murmured, but they forgot who built this place. Thunder rumbled in. Response, low and distant, like an answer from the heavens. He smiled faintly, the corners of his mouth tightening. Tomorrow, Karen Bishop would find out her plan wasn't as untouchable as she thought. And when she came back, she wouldn't be facing a broken man holding on to memories. She'd be facing a Turner, armed with proof, patience, and the kind of silence that made arrogant people very, very afraid. By morning the storm had passed, leaving Silverpine Lake covered in a layer of thin fog that clung to the water like a ghost refusing to leave. The mansion stood silent against the gray light, the wet leaves glistening on the porch steps as Mark Turner stepped outside with a steaming mug of coffee in his hand. The world smelled of rain and pine. But there was something else in the air too. A tension that pressed against his skin, a quiet warning that the fight was far from over. He didn't have to wait long to see why. The rumble of engines came again from the main road, and through the mist he saw a row of cars pulling up to the gate, black sedans and one white SUV that gleamed like it didn't belong here. The doors opened almost in sync, and out stepped Karen Bishop, flanked by two men in suits and a younger assistant clutching a tablet. Their expressions cold and calculated, like people who had come not to argue but to remind him of his place. Karen smiled that practiced smile. The one meant to look polite but carried a blade behind it. Mr. Turner, she said sweetly. I see you're still here. I thought you might have come to your senses by now. Mark sipped his coffee slowly, leaning on the porch railing, his voice calm but sharp. Morning to you too, Karen. Did you bring another demolition crew or just the fan club? Her smile tightened. Cute, but no. I'm here to deliver official notice from the Silverpine HOA. She waved her hand, and her assistant hurried forward, handing Mark a crisp white envelope with the HOA's seal stamped in red. This, Karen said, is a formal eviction and demolition authorization under Section 14 of the Community Restoration Act. Mark tore it open, scanning the pages without expression. The letter was full of dense legal words designed to intimidate. Terms like noncompliance, condemned structure, and community interest, but all of it meant one thing. They were bluffing, using bureaucracy as a weapon. You're wasting ink, he said finally. This order's invalid. The court injunction already froze all HOA activity on this land. You'd know that if you actually read the notice from the county. Karen tilted her head, her fake sympathy returning. Oh, Mark, she said. You don't really think that's going to stop us, do you? You can't fight the entire HOA with a piece of paper and an old house. Mark's eyes didn't waver. Funny, he said softly. That's exactly what you're trying to do. The two men behind her shifted uncomfortably, but she kept going, her voice louder now, echoing across the wet yard. Let me explain this to you, Mr. Turner. This lake belongs to the Silverpine community. It's a shared space, and your so-called mansion has become an eyesore, a hazard, and a liability. It's dragging down property values, and frankly, people are tired of looking at it. So one way or another, it's coming down. Mark smiled faintly, his tone even colder. You mean you're tired of looking at it, because it reminds you that not everything here belongs to you? Karen's face hardened, her charm slipping for just a second. You can play hero all you want, but at the end of the day, the HOA has authority over what happens here. We have the backing of investors and the county's support. Mark stepped down from the porch, closing the distance between them until they were eye to eye, his voice dropping to a low, controlled whisper. Then maybe you should ask the county why they called me last night to confirm ownership. Karen blinked, her confidence faltering as he continued. Because your paperwork isn't just fake, it's criminal. The two men exchanged looks, clearly unsettled. One whispered something to Karen, but she waved him off, forcing a smirk. You can't prove that, she said, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her. I don't need to, Mark said. The county will, and when they do, you and your board are going to answer for every nail you tried to drive into my property. He turned and started walking back toward the mansion, his boots leaving prints in the damp ground. Karen called after him, her voice sharp, with frustration. You'll regret this, Turner. I promise you that. He stopped halfway up the steps, turning slightly, his eyes calm and unreadable. The last person who threatened my grandfather on this land lost their title, their car, and their pride, he said quietly. Guess history really does repeat itself. The HOA cars left soon after, their engines fading into the distance. But the damage had already been done. The message was clear. They weren't backing down, and neither was he. Later that afternoon, as rain began to fall again, Mark sat at his desk reviewing new emails from Ellen. She had uncovered more evidence. Old inspection reports that proved the HOA had lied about safety hazards. They'd even photoshopped cracks and water damage into fake images to justify their demolition plan. Mark's fingers tightened on the mouse, his jaw set. They weren't just arrogant, they were corrupt, and it was time someone made them answer for it. He called Ellen immediately. How strong is this evidence? He asked. She replied without hesitation. Strong enough to bury them in court. I'm drafting a formal complaint to the district attorney tonight. Mark's lips curved into a grim smile. Good, because I think it's time they realized what happens when you steal from the wrong family. That night, thunder rolled again across the lake, and the wind howled through the trees like the mansion itself was alive. Awake after years of silence, Mark stood by the window, watching lightning flash over the water, each strike illuminating the faint reflection of his home in the waves, a reminder that even old things could endure. His mind replayed the image of Karen's face when he mentioned the county's call, that flicker of fear she tried so hard to hide. He could feel it now, the balance of power shifting, for the first time. She wasn't the one in control, and tomorrow, When the county investigators arrived to verify the land records, the truth would come crashing down on her like a hammer. He turned from the window, extinguished the lantern, and whispered into the dark. "Let's see how loud you are when the law comes knocking." The house creaked as if in agreement, and outside, the lake rippled with the first drops of a new storm. The next morning came wrapped in silence, a deceptive kind of quiet that always comes before a storm. The air around Silverpine Lake was still, the water perfectly smooth, reflecting the dull gray clouds above like a mirror that refused to blink. Mark Turner woke to the faint sound of distant engines rumbling across the valley, steady and heavy, like thunder rolling in the wrong direction. He stepped out onto the porch, the cold air biting against his face, and what he saw made his pulse tighten. Coming down the dirt road were 6 vehicles. 3 trucks loaded with demolition equipment and 3 black SUVs with the Silverpine HOA logo stamped on the doors. The convoy stopped at the gate, and within seconds, a dozen men stepped out, hard hats, reflective vests, and steel boots hitting the ground in rhythm. At the front of the pack, standing tall in a bright orange jacket and dark sunglasses, was Karen Bishop, her chin lifted high, her confidence back. This time she wasn't here to argue. She was here to finish what she started. Mark leaned against the porch post, calm, silent, watching them fan out like soldiers preparing for battle. Karen clutched a clipboard in one hand and a folded document in the other. The wind caught her hair as she shouted over the noise of the trucks. "Mr. Turner, I'm here under authority of the Silverpine Lakeside Homeowners Association. This structure is being demolished today as scheduled." She waved the paper like a victory flag. "You had your chance to comply. Now step aside." Mark didn't move, his expression unreadable, his voice even when he finally spoke. "That injunction I filed last night still stands, Karen, and you're trespassing on protected land." She laughed, loud and false. "That little stunt of yours was temporary, Turner. The county cleared it this morning. You lost." Her voice cracked at the end, but she masked it with another forced smile. "Now be a reasonable man and don't make this harder for yourself." Mark slowly walked down the steps, boots thudding against the damp wood, each step deliberate, measured. He stopped a few feet away from her, his presence alone enough to make some of the workers hesitate. "Reasonable?" he said quietly, his eyes steady on hers. "You forged my name on legal documents, tried to steal my family's home, and now you want me to be reasonable?" She didn't flinch, but her smile faltered. "You can't prove that," she said, her tone sharper now. "We've done everything by the book." Mark pulled a folded sheet of paper from his jacket, the county seal visible even from where she stood. "Funny," he said, holding it up. "Because this says otherwise. The district attorney opened a criminal investigation into your HOA this morning. Forgery, zoning fraud, and property tampering. Those are the charges." Karen froze, her eyes darting from the paper to his face. "You're bluffing?" she whispered, but he didn't answer. Instead, he simply nodded toward the road behind her. "Then you might want to explain that," he said. All eyes turned to the new set of headlights appearing down the road, 2 sheriff's cruisers and a county inspector's vehicle pulling up behind the HOA convoy. The sirens were off, but the message was loud enough. The deputy stepped out first, tall and broad-shouldered, his badge glinting in the morning light. "Karen Bishop?" he called, his voice steady. "You and your crew are ordered to stand down until the investigation into the Silverpine development permits is complete." Karen's face turned pale. "You can't be serious. This is my project," she snapped, but the deputy only shook his head. "Not anymore, it's not, ma'am. County law states any active demolition on disputed property is a criminal offense." He turned to Mark, his expression softening. "Mr. Turner, we apologize for the trouble. We'll make sure nothing more happens here without your consent." Mark nodded once in acknowledgement, his gaze still on Karen, who stood frozen, gripping her clipboard so tightly her knuckles went white. The workers began to shuffle awkwardly, exchanging nervous looks. One of them muttered, "We should go, boss." But Karen didn't move, her pride wouldn't let her. She looked at Mark like she was seeing him for the first time, not as some quiet man from the country, but as someone who had just dismantled everything she thought she controlled. "You think you've won," she said bitterly, her voice trembling. "You think you can just walk away after embarrassing me?" Mark's tone stayed calm, but there was iron beneath it. "No, Karen, I don't think I've won anything," he said. "I just stopped you from destroying what never belonged to you." The sheriff's men began taping off the area, marking it as restricted until the county completed their inspection. The workers packed up in silence, loading their tools and machinery back into the trucks. No one dared to look at Karen as she stood there trembling, rage flickering behind her eyes. Mark turned and started walking back toward the mansion, his boots crunching softly against the gravel, the sound of engines fading behind him as the convoy retreated. Halfway up the steps, he stopped and looked back one last time. Karen was still there, standing alone by the gate, her clipboard dangling uselessly from her hand. She looked smaller now, deflated, all the arrogance drained from her face. "You should have asked," he said quietly, just loud enough for her to hear. "That's all you ever had to do." By noon, the lake was silent again, the fog beginning to lift as the sun broke through the clouds, its golden reflection spreading across the calm water. Mark stood on the porch, watching the sheriff's cars disappear down the road. The old mansion behind him seemed to breathe easier, its walls no longer under threat. For the first time in years, it felt alive again. He placed his hand on one of the porch columns, rough and cold under his palm. "We're safe now," he murmured, more to his grandfather's memory than himself. The wind stirred the trees in reply, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and rain. Far away, thunder rolled once and faded into silence. The storm had passed, but the story of what had happened on the edge of Silverpine Lake was only beginning to spread. Neighbors would talk, rumors would grow, and soon the whole county would know how one man stood against an entire HOA and sent their bulldozers home empty. The following days unfolded like the slow tightening of a noose, quiet but deliberate, the kind of silence that comes before justice strikes. The storm clouds had cleared over Silverpine Lake, and the mansion stood tall again under the golden morning sun. The air crisp, the water still, but beneath that calm surface, something was shifting. Mark Turner spent his days gathering evidence, organizing every document, every map, every signed letter that the HOA had used to justify their theft. He worked from dawn until dusk at the same wooden desk his grandfather once used, the one that had weathered storms far greater than this, the steady scratching of his pen the only sound inside those old walls. Each night he'd light the lantern and reread his notes, his face calm but his eyes burning with purpose. He wasn't just defending his land anymore. He was exposing the rot that had poisoned the community for years, and he intended to rip it out by the roots. By the end of the week, Ellen called with updates that made him stop mid-step. "You're not going to believe this, Mark," she said over the phone, excitement in her tone. "The county investigators found inconsistencies in every HOA permit tied to the Silverpine development. They falsified safety reports, faked signatures, and even funneled money through a shell company. The DA's office is preparing charges." Mark didn't say anything for a moment. He just let the words sink in. "Good," he said finally, his voice low and steady. "Now let's make sure everyone sees it." That afternoon, Ellen sent him copies of the investigation documents, and Mark took them straight to the local newspaper editor, a man who had grown up hearing stories about his grandfather's lake house. "I'm not asking for sympathy," Mark told him, setting the folder on the desk. "I'm asking for truth." The editor opened the files, scanned the first few pages, and leaned back, whistling under his breath. "You realize this is going to blow up, right?" Mark nodded. "That's the point." The next morning, the headline hit the stands across town. HOA fraud exposed, illegal land grabs and forged documents at Silverpine Lake. The story spread faster than anyone expected. Neighbors who had once been afraid to question the HOA now spoke out, sharing stories of unfair fines, property threats, and backroom deals. People realized that what happened to Mark wasn't an isolated act. It was part of a pattern, one the board had built their power on for years. Karen Bishop's phone didn't stop ringing. Investors pulled out of the project, sponsors vanished overnight, and the community she ruled through fear began to turn on her. Angry residents gathered outside the HOA office demanding her resignation. "You promised us progress," one shouted. "But all you built were lies." Cameras from local news stations arrived, filming her trying to push through the crowd with the same smug face that now looked more like a mask cracking under pressure. But the real reckoning came 2 days later when county officials showed up at her door with a warrant. The sound of police radios crackled across the quiet neighborhood as Karen stood frozen in her driveway. Her expensive blazer rumpled, her voice trembling as she tried to talk her way out of it. "There must be some mistake," she insisted. "I didn't forge anything. My lawyers handled the paperwork." But the officer just handed her a thick envelope stamped with the county seal. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "you're under investigation for zoning fraud, falsification of legal documents, and attempted unlawful demolition of private property." The neighbors watched from their porches as she was led back inside for questioning. The same woman who once handed out fines for cracked driveways was now facing the kind of penalty that no fine could erase. Meanwhile, at the mansion, Mark stood by the window, watching the headlines unfold on his laptop, the flickering glow of the screen reflecting in his steady eyes. He didn't smile. Victory wasn't something he needed to celebrate. It was something he expected when the truth came out. But it wasn't over yet. He knew there was still damage to undo, and he intended to fix it himself. That afternoon, he met with a group of local craftsmen, men who remembered when the Turner mansion had been the heart of the lake. "We're bringing it back," he said simply. They worked for days, restoring what time and neglect had taken. New planks for the dock, fresh paint on the railings, the roof patched and shining under the sunlight. Each strike of the hammer echoed with purpose, every brushstroke a statement that the house, and its legacy, still stood. Word spread again, but this time not about corruption, about renewal. Families from the nearby communities drove by to see the mansion rising back to life. Children pointed at the water where ducks swam freely again, and older neighbors smiled quietly, remembering what the place used to mean. The county even sent a crew to remove the remaining HOA restricted zone signs from around the property. When they asked Mark if he wanted to press civil charges for damages, he simply shook his head. "No need," he said. "The land remembers." Those words carried weight, enough that even the reporters who returned for follow-up interviews quoted him. As night fell, Mark stood on the newly repaired porch, the smell of sawdust and fresh paint still thick in the air. Across the lake, he could see the faint reflection of town lights shimmering on the surface, calm and steady, just like his heartbeat. Ellen called again, her voice lighter than before. "They've shut down the HOA officially," she said. "Every member resigned, the accounts frozen, and the city's taking over the land management." Mark exhaled deeply, leaning against the porch rail. "Good," he said quietly. "Maybe now people can stop being afraid." "You did more than that," Ellen replied. "You reminded them that one man standing his ground can move an entire town." Mark chuckled softly. "I didn't move anything, Ellen. I just refused to." Before hanging up, he glanced at the lake one more time. The moon had risen high, its reflection perfectly mirrored on the water. The house behind him no longer looked abandoned. Its windows glowed with warm light, its walls strong again, alive. The land felt at peace, as though the ghosts of the past were finally resting. He closed his eyes for a moment, hearing his grandfather's voice echo in the back of his mind, proud and calm. "That's how you do it, boy. You don't fight with noise. You fight with proof." Mark opened his eyes again and smiled faintly, whispering into the quiet night, "I learned from the best." The wind blew gently through the pines, carrying away the last echoes of the HOA's arrogance, leaving behind only the sound of the lake, steady, timeless, and free. Weeks passed and the chaos around Silverpine Lake slowly gave way to peace. The kind of calm that comes after a storm has burned itself out. The air was clearer, the nights quieter, and for the first time in years, the water reflected the mansion without the shadow of bulldozers or warning signs hanging over it. The news had run its course. The county had closed the investigation, and the once powerful HOA had been dissolved by court order. Karen Bishop was gone. Her name now whispered with disgust in the same community meetings she once ruled like a queen. Her face occasionally appeared on local news reports standing outside the courthouse, her posture stiff, her confidence long gone, and while others chased her downfall, Mark Turner didn't bother to watch. He wasn't interested in revenge anymore. He was interested in restoration. The lake, the house, and the memory of the generations before him deserved better than bitterness. He worked day and night not because he had to, but because he wanted the place to live again. The mansion's walls, once cracked and fading, now gleamed in a fresh coat of white. The red roof shone bright under the sun, and the porches that once sagged now stretched proud and sturdy, overlooking the glassy lake. Word spread that Mark was rebuilding the Turner estate not just for himself but for the town. People started coming by to help. Old neighbors, retired carpenters, local students looking for summer work. They brought tools, paint, and food, sharing stories as they worked. "Your grandfather helped my father fix his roof once," one old man said, hammering nails into a railing. "He never asked for a thing in return." Mark smiled softly, replying, "Then I guess it's my turn to return the favor." The community that had been divided by the HOA's greed was now united by something older and stronger: gratitude and memory. A month later, the mansion stood complete. Its reflection on the lake looked almost unreal, like a piece of history reborn. Mark hosted a small gathering on the front lawn, inviting everyone who had helped or lived nearby. The county officials came too, this time not with badges or clipboards, but with smiles. Ellen drove up from the city to be there, her eyes wide as she stepped out of her car. "You really did it," she said, looking up at the house. "We did it," Mark corrected. "You, the county, the town. Everyone who refused to let this place die." They stood together watching the sunset paint the sky orange and gold, the reflection shimmering across the calm water, a scene that felt both like an ending and a beginning. Later that evening, when the crowd had gone and the laughter had faded into the soft hum of crickets, Mark sat on the porch alone, the night air cool and still, a lantern flickering beside him. He looked out at the lake, the same view his grandfather once had every night before turning in, and felt a quiet peace settle over him. He thought about everything that had happened: the arrogance of the HOA, the threats, the lies, the storm of legal battles, and realized something deeper had come from it all. He hadn't just saved his house. He had reminded an entire town that some things can't be bought, stolen, or controlled. Land wasn't just dirt and paper. It was legacy, family, and memory carved into the soil. In town, people began calling the old Turner mansion the house that stood, a name that carried its own kind of poetry. It became a symbol of defiance, a reminder that power built on greed would always crumble when faced with truth and resolve. The county even designated the surrounding area as a protected heritage site, ensuring no HOA or developer could ever touch it again. When a reporter asked Mark how it felt to have one, he simply said, "It's not about winning. It's about remembering who you are and where you come from." His words spread quietly, printed in the local paper beneath a photo of him standing on the porch, the lake behind him glowing under the morning light. As summer deepened, Mark continued to live in the mansion, fixing small things here and there, planting new trees by the shore, and sometimes sitting by the water with a cup of coffee watching the sunrise. He didn't need crowds or headlines. He had the lake, the wind, and the quiet heartbeat of a home that refused to die. On certain nights, when the moonlight shimmered across the ripples, he swore he could still hear his grandfather's voice whispering through the pines, proud and content. "You kept your promise, boy," the voice would say, and Mark would nod softly to the night, his eyes glinting with the reflection of the lake. "I told you I would." The story of the Turner mansion spread far beyond Silverpine, told in towns and forums and small talk over coffee, about the man who returned home to find bulldozers on his land and turned a broken house into a legend. And as long as the lake remained calm under the stars, so did the legacy of the man who defended it.